Frene Ginwala, ANC national spokesperson, joins us now on the line. Mr. Mabe, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. A very sad news, your reaction to the death of Dr. Frene Ginwala.
The African National Congress dips its revolutionary banner as it mourns the passing of a great leader and architect of our democratic, non-racial and non-sexist South Africa. The National Executive Committee of the ANC extends its heartfelt condolences to the family, loved ones and comrades of Dr. Frene Ginwala. Dr. Frene Ginwala was a member of the African National Congress since the 1950s, serving on its National Executive Committee, heading its research department and later its archives committee. Comrade Frene served the people in many capacities in the ANC underground in the 1950s, working with the Indian Congresses, and as a student arranging for the escape of Comrade President O.R. Tambo into exile. She followed into exile shortly thereafter and served in many capacities, including as managing editor of Tanzanian main English language daily and Sunday papers, The Standard and Sunday News in 1969. Her commitment to the emancipation as an activist and intellectual was unparalleled. With her iconic article on women in the ANC, 1912-1943, published in 1990, which dispelled myths about women's role in the struggle. She was a founder and national convener of the Women's National Coalition, which mobilized women across political lines and sectors to participate in the country's negotiations in the early 1990s, drafting the second Women's Charter and successfully saw the inclusion of the non-sexism and equality clause of the country's constitution. Between 1990 and 1992, she also served in the ANC's Commission on Gender Equality and was part of the National Task Force to relaunch the ANC Women's League. As an ANC Member of Parliament, she became the first Speaker of a non-racial parliament and laid the foundations not only for the legislative arm of government, but for the human rights, constitutional and democratic ethos of our country. Comrade Ginwala passed on at the age of 90 and will be remembered as a revolutionary activist who throughout her life fought for freedom, justice and equality. Ambagahle, Comrade Speaker, Dr. Frene Ginwala.
Mr. Mabe, let me ask you, something from a personal point of view. A lot of people have, of course, described her, wearing different hats. How do you remember Dr. Frene Ginwala? And more importantly, what should her legacy be for South Africans?
Well, Dr. Frene Ginwala should be remembered as an architect of our own democratic dispensation, standing for the rights of all and non-racial South Africa. And that we, the young ones, who still enjoy the rare privilege of occupying leadership positions in the ANC, must stand for what is right, which is what Dr. Frene Ginwala and their generation stood for. We've got to make sure that, one, we recognize the leadership of women in the African National Congress, but also we recognize an organization that stands for everyone across racial groupings. That is an organization that Dr. Frene really devoted a full life to.
All right, Mr. Mabe, thank you so much for that tribute. Of course, that was the ANC's Frene Ginwala. Let's now go to Sinao Tambo, EFF national spokesperson. Mr. Tambo, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Your reaction as the EFF on the passing of Dr. Frene Ginwala.
Look, as the economic freedom fighters, we dip our heads in solidarity to the passing of the liberation stalwart Frene Ginwala, as someone who is part of a dying breed of an activist, an all-round, an intellectual, an academic, a lawyer, an activist, who sacrificed her life and risked herself in the intellectual and physical sphere of contest for the liberation of African people. We dip our heads in honor of her, and as the EFF, we take inspiration that someone was able to dedicate their life not only the intellectual capacitation of our revolution and exhibiting that African people, even of Indian descent, because we know that Indian people were regarded as black in the historical conception of what black people were and how they were treated in South Africa. She was able to dedicate her life in conceptualizing and placing African people and black people in the intellectual terrain and exhibiting that we are much more than hewers of wood and troughs of water, as Frene used to say. So we salute her. We salute her role in the struggle in ensuring comrades were able to go into exile and build the necessary links internationally, and her campaigns which she led and ran in the international community to cause the sanctions. So we are inspired by that type of caliber of leadership and draw inspiration from it.
And of course, in that introduction that we read earlier on, in terms of what President Cyril Ramaphosa said in his tribute, saying that she was a giant among a special generation of leaders to whom we owe our freedom and to whom we owe our commitment to keep building the South Africa to which they devoted their all. How do you think we can do that? And of course, making sure that her legacy lives on.
Look, I think one of the basic defenses of her legacy would be, of course, to uphold and defend the constitution that she was part and parcel of crafting as well. The constitution that she was born as a speaker into in the first democratic dispensation of our country. So if we have any respect for her legacy, we must have respect for the constitution that she was a speaker of over a decade. We must take lessons from her level of integrity, her level of selflessness, and respect for African and South African people. And that is the legacy that we must all draw inspiration from. And we don't want to speak ill upon her death, but we hope that some will reflect on their own actions and their own treatment of the constitution that she was part of crafting, in order to ensure that they're an example of integrity in South Africa.
All right, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Of course, that was Sinawo Tambo, EFF national spokesperson. Let's now go to Siviwe Gwahube she's a DA national spokesperson, and of course also wears many hats in the party. Ma'am, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Now, of course, Dr. Ginwala has been remembered as a formidable intellect and, of course, a great leader of our time. How would you define her?
Look, I think firstly, we send our deepest condolences not only to her family, to her friends, and those in her political party. But I think when we were reflecting particularly on the legacy that Dr. Ginwala has left, particularly at a time where we are asking ourselves, what is the role of Parliament in bettering the lives of ordinary South Africans, we realize that people like her have laid the groundwork really about how powerful the national legislature can be, because of course she was the first speaker of a democratic parliament and was very much instrumental in presiding over a parliament that would go on to repeal apartheid laws, replace them with laws that would be encompassed in our constitution, was one of the contributors of our constitution. And so really today we bid farewell to somebody who has been part of the infrastructure of our democratic South Africa. And so she leaves behind a legacy that I think is quite important. And for us, may it be a guiding light for all of us, that in fact, when you've got a legislature that works, that you can really start to materially change the lives of ordinary people.
And of course, she was really a torchbearer, for women empowerment, as well as, fighting for the rights of women, even after she had stepped from, her political life, as you can call it. She called on the emancipation of women and, of course, for women to continue to fight.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those that it's one of those rare legacies that one has, where regardless of where you may be in your political persuasion, you couldn't help but really notice the giant that she was in South Africa, in our South African political life, and of course she led the way in very much in the women in politics, women in leadership in South Africa, and I think again I just want to reiterate that I think the legacy that she leaves behind is very much instructive, not only to political leaders in general in South Africa, but also women in South African politics, that if people like her could have started the way back in 1994 in leading the way into a democratic dispensation in South Africa, then we should be far more ahead than we currently are, and that the work is far from being done. And so, as I say, regardless of where you stand politically, I think we can really recognize that she was an inspirational, not only a woman in politics, but she was an inspirational presiding officer in an institution that could not be more crucial, particularly at the time during which she presided.